The cold bit through James Miller's worn jacket as he huddled against the brick wall of the downtown pharmacy. December in San Francisco wasn't as brutal as winters in other parts of the country, but when you lived on the streets, every degree of chill cut straight to the bone. He pulled his threadbare beanie lower over his ears, the material thin enough that it did little to block the persistent wind that tunneled between the city's buildings. James adjusted the cardboard sign propped against his knapsack. Veteran, anything helps. God bless. Simple, direct, and painfully true. At 42, he'd spent more years serving his country than he had trying to reintegrate into civilian life. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left him with more than just the visible scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline. The invisible wounds, PTSD, depression, night terrors, those were the ones that had cost him his marriage, his job, and eventually his home. The sidewalk beneath him felt like ice through his jeans, and James shifted uncomfortably, trying to find a position that would take pressure off his bad knee. The morning crowd hurried past, most averting their eyes as if his homelessness might be contagious. Some days James felt as invisible as a ghost, haunting the margins of a world that had moved on without him. A young businesswoman dropped $1 into his cup as she passed, not breaking stride, not making eye contact. James nodded his thanks anyway. God bless, he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. The small paper cup now held $3 and some change. Enough for a cup of coffee and maybe an egg sandwich if he went to the right place. If you're finding this story meaningful, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like James's to light, shining a spotlight on the hidden heroes among us. Now let's continue with James's unexpected encounter. The morning sun had finally risen high enough to cast weak light over the street, but it offered little warmth. James rubbed his hands together, his fingers stiff and reddened from the cold. He could smell the coffee from the shop across the street, the rich aroma carried on the wind like a taunt. That's when he saw him. The man was walking alone, hands tucked into the pockets of a weathered leather jacket. His face was partially obscured by a baseball cap pulled low, but there was something unmistakable about his gait. Confident but measured, like someone who knew exactly where he was going, but was in no particular rush to get there. James blinked, sure he was seeing things. But no, it couldn't be. Could it? The man crossed the street, coming closer, and James felt his heart begin to hammer against his ribs. He knew that face, had seen it countless times on screen, had watched his movies during long nights in barracks overseas, finding comfort in the familiar stories of justice and redemption. Clint Eastwood. James straightened up instinctively, military training kicking in even after all these years. There was something surreal about seeing someone so iconic in such an ordinary setting, like spotting a tiger strolling down the cereal aisle at a grocery store. For a moment, James forgot about the cold, about his hunger, about the constant ache in his knee. As Eastwood drew nearer, walking along the same stretch of sidewalk, James felt a strange mix of emotions. Should he say something? Would it matter? Celebrities were probably approached by strangers all the time. And why would someone like Clint Eastwood stop for someone like him? But then, something unexpected happened. As Eastwood passed, he glanced James's way, and their eyes met. There was a moment of pause, a flicker of recognition that seemed to pass between them. Not the recognition of fame, something else, something deeper. James had seen that look before, on the faces of other veterans, a silent acknowledgement of shared experience. And then Eastwood was passing by, continuing down the sidewalk. James hesitated for just a moment before the words tumbled out. "The Outpost, sir," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Your son's film. Best thing I've seen about what it was really like over there." Eastwood stopped. For a moment he stood perfectly still, his back to James. Then slowly he turned. His eyes, sharp and clear despite his age, studied James with an intensity that felt almost physical. James resisted the urge to look away, to shrink back into the wall. There was something in those eyes. Not pity, which James had come to recognize and resent, but something more like curiosity, maybe even respect. "You served?" Eastwood asked, his voice that familiar gravelly rumble that had narrated so many classic films. James nodded. "Yes, sir, Army. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Eastwood's gaze traveled down to James' worn boots, then to the small American flag patch still clinging to his backpack, and finally to the sign resting against it. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The city moved around them in its usual hurried rhythm, but between them, time seemed suspended. Mind if I join you for a minute? Eastwood finally asked, gesturing to the empty space of sidewalk beside James. Before James could process what was happening, Clint Eastwood, Hollywood legend, Oscar-winning director, cultural icon, was lowering himself down to sit beside him on the cold sidewalk, back against the brick wall of the pharmacy. Sir, you don't have to, James started, but Eastwood waved him off. Old bones could use a rest anyway, he said with a hint of a smile. Besides, I've sat in worse places. James couldn't help but smile back, though it felt strange on his face, like a muscle that hadn't been used in too long. When was the last time he genuinely smiled? He couldn't remember. Eastwood pulled his cap lower as a couple of pedestrians walked by, giving them curious glances. So, 3 tours, he said once they had passed. That's a lot of time in a war zone. Yes, sir, James replied. 2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment. My dad was in the Army, Eastwood said. Served during World War II. Different war, different time. But I imagine some things stay the same. James nodded. The waiting, the fear, the brotherhood, he said softly. Those things don't change much. Eastwood studied him carefully. And coming home? He asked. How was that transition for you? James felt his throat tighten. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected to have today, or ever, really, especially not with Clint Eastwood. But there was something about the man's direct gaze that made James want to be honest. Not good, he admitted. Had some issues, PTSD, couldn't hold down work. Wife couldn't handle it. Can't blame her, really. He gestured vaguely at his current situation. And here we are. Eastwood nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. How long have you been on the street? Going on 2 years now, James said. He could feel a familiar shame creeping up his neck, hot and unwelcome. VA has a backlog. I'm on some waiting lists for housing assistance, but he trailed off with a small shrug. A silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something strangely companionable about sitting there with this man, both of them watching the city go by. James could smell the leather of Eastwood's jacket, the faint scent of aftershave, so different from his own unwashed state that he felt suddenly self-conscious. I've played a lot of tough guys, Eastwood said after a while, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Made a career out of it. But the real tough guys, they're the ones who do what you did. Go into real danger, face real bullets, real consequences. He turned to look at James directly. Hollywood's just make-believe. What you did was real. James felt something shift inside him, a tight knot of emotion he'd been carrying for so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. For years he'd felt forgotten, discarded by the very country he'd risked his life to protect. But in this moment, this strange, unexpected moment, he felt seen. Eastwood reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook and pen. I'm going to write down an address, he said, scribbling something on a blank page. There's a place I know, runs a program for veterans. Good people. He tore out the page and handed it to James. Ask for Mike Sullivan. Tell him I sent you. James took the paper with numb fingers, staring at the neat handwriting. I don't understand, he said. Eastwood stood up, brushing off his jeans. They help vets get back on their feet. Housing, job training, the whole deal. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a card, handing it to James as well. And this is my production office. When you're ready for work, call that number. Ask for Janet. She'll set something up. James stared at the card, then back up at Eastwood, sure he'd misheard. Work? Sir, I don't. Studios always need security personnel, Eastwood said matter-of-factly. Military background is a plus, and I could use someone who knows the difference between Hollywood tough and the real thing. He extended his hand down to James. James hesitated for just a moment before taking it. Eastwood's grip was firm, his hand warm against James's cold fingers. Thank you, sir, was all James could manage to say. Eastwood nodded once. Don't thank me yet, Thank me when you're back on your feet." He pulled up the collar of his jacket against the wind. "Which address are you going to visit first?" James looked down at the paper and card in his hand, both feeling as weighty as gold. "The Veterans Program," he said after a moment's thought. Eastwood smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Good choice." He dug into his pocket once more and pulled out something else, a thick envelope that he handed to James. "This should help get you there and cover whatever you need for the next few weeks." James took the envelope, feeling the substantial weight of it. Before he could say anything, before he could find the words to express the hurricane of emotions swirling inside him, Eastwood was stepping back, giving him a small nod, and then turning to continue down the sidewalk. "Mr. Eastwood," James called after him, his voice thick. When the older man paused and looked back, James stood up straight, squaring his shoulders, and offered a perfect military salute. "Thank you, sir." Clint Eastwood returned the salute with solemn respect, then turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner into the flow of the city. James stood there for a long moment, the paper, card, and envelope clutched in his hand, feeling as though he'd just experienced some kind of dream. Slowly, with fingers that trembled slightly, he opened the envelope. Cash. More cash than he'd seen in years. Enough to get him a room, clean clothes, food, transportation, everything he'd need to follow through on Eastwood's offer of help. As the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, James felt something crack inside him, a wall he'd built around his emotions, his hopes, his belief in his own future. For the first time in longer than he could remember, tears filled his eyes, blurring his vision of the busy street before him. For years, James had moved through each day focused solely on survival. Eat if you can, find shelter, stay warm. Don't think about tomorrow because tomorrow will be the same as today. But now suddenly, unexpectedly, there was a tomorrow worth thinking about. There was a path forward offered by the most unlikely of guides. With hands still shaking, James carefully folded the paper with the program's address and tucked it, along with Eastwood's card and the envelope, into the inner pocket of his jacket, close to his heart. Then he gathered his few belongings, straightened his back, and began walking. Not aimlessly, as he had for so long, but with purpose, with direction. The cold still bit at his exposed skin, and his knee still ached with each step. But somehow these discomforts seemed more bearable now. As he walked, James felt the weight of invisibility lifting from his shoulders. He had been seen, truly seen, by someone who didn't have to look. And in that moment of being seen, something had awoken inside him that he thought had died long ago in the dust and danger of a foreign battlefield. Hope. A week later, James stood outside a modest building in a quieter part of the city. The address Eastwood had given him had led to a converted schoolhouse, now home to the Veterans Reintegration Program. According to the sign, they offered housing assistance, mental health services, job training, and community support specifically for veterans struggling with their return to civilian life. James adjusted the collar of his new shirt, the first new clothing he'd owned in years, and took a deep breath. The money Eastwood had given him had allowed him to rent a small motel room, buy some decent clothes, and get cleaned up. He'd even visited a barber, trimming his wild beard and shaggy hair into something more presentable. The face that had looked back at him from the mirror afterward had been almost unrecognizable. Not quite the young soldier he'd once been, but not the broken man he'd become either. Someone in between, someone with a chance. Now standing before the door that could lead to the next chapter of his life, James felt a familiar anxiety creeping up his spine. What if this was all some elaborate misunderstanding? What if they turned him away? What if this fragile bubble of hope burst, leaving him back where he started? "You gonna stand there all day, son, or are you coming in?" James turned to see an older man with silver hair and a military bearing watching him from the doorway. His eyes were kind but assessing, taking in James's appearance with a glance that seemed to see more than just the surface. "Are you Mike Sullivan?" James asked. The man nodded. "I am. And judging by that look on your face and the way you're standing there like you're waiting for permission to breathe, I'm guessing you might be the fellow Clint called me about." James blinked in surprise. He called you? Sullivan chuckled. Course he did. Man doesn't do anything halfway. He stepped back, holding the door open. Come on in, James. Let's talk about getting you back on your feet. The interior of the building was warm and surprisingly homey, with comfortable furniture, walls painted in calming colors, and artwork created by veterans displayed throughout. Sullivan led James to a small office and gestured for him to take a seat. Clint said you did 3 tours in Afghanistan, Sullivan said, settling behind his desk. Army, right? James nodded. Yes, sir. Cut the Zer crap, Sullivan said with a smile. I worked for those stripes same as you. Mike is fine. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. Now why don't you tell me your story? The real one, not the sanitized version? For the next hour, James found himself talking more than he had in months, possibly years. He told Sullivan about the ambush that had left half his unit dead, about the nightmares that still woke him screaming, about the rage that would sometimes overtake him without warning, making it impossible to hold down a job or maintain relationships. He talked about his failed marriage, his estrangement from his family, and his eventual descent into homelessness. Sullivan listened without interruption, without judgment, occasionally making notes. When James finally fell silent, emotionally drained from the unburdening, Sullivan nodded slowly. Nothing I haven't heard before, he said. Doesn't make it any easier, but you're not alone in this, James. Not by a long shot. He tapped his pen against the notepad. Here's what we're going to do. We've got a transitional housing unit opening up next week. It's yours if you want it. Small, but it's private, clean, and safe. While you're there, we'll get you set up with our PTSD support group, one-on-one therapy, and our job readiness program. James felt lightheaded. Just like that? Sullivan's expression softened. This isn't charity, son. This is what you earned with your service. Should have been available to you from day one when you came home. He leaned back in his chair. Now, Clint mentioned something about a job opportunity down the line. James nodded, still processing the sudden turn his life had taken. He said to call his production office when I was ready. Good, Sullivan said. That's step 2. But first things first, let's get you settled, get you the support you need, and then we'll talk about getting back to work. Deal? James extended his hand across the desk. Deal. 6 months later, James straightened his tie as he walked through the security checkpoint at Malpaso Productions. The guard, recognizing him from his previous visits, gave him a friendly nod. Good luck today, Miller. Though from what I hear, you don't need it. James smiled his thanks, still not entirely comfortable with the good fortune that had befallen him. The past 6 months had been challenging in ways he hadn't expected. Living indoors again, adhering to schedules, confronting his trauma in therapy, each step had presented its own hurdles. There had been setbacks, days when the darkness threatened to overwhelm him again, when the old urge to run, to isolate, to numb himself had nearly won out. But through it all, there had been Sullivan and the team at the Veterans Program, providing structure, support, and when necessary, tough love. And there had been the knowledge that Clint Eastwood, a man who didn't have to care, who could have walked past him like thousands of others had seen something in him worth salvaging. Now as he made his way to the production office for his final interview, James felt a nervous energy unlike anything he'd experienced since his return from war. This wasn't the paralyzing anxiety that had once ruled his life, but rather an anticipation, an eagerness to prove himself worthy of the chance he'd been given. Janet, Eastwood's longtime assistant, greeted him with a warm smile. He's waiting for you, she said, gesturing toward an open door. And between you and me, I think you've got this in the bag. James took a deep breath and entered the office. Clint Eastwood sat behind a desk scattered with scripts and production notes. He looked up as James entered, those same intense eyes taking in the transformation before him. The clean-cut hair, the pressed shirt and tie, the clear gaze that no longer darted away in shame. James, Eastwood said, standing to shake his hand. Good to see you. Good to see you too, sir, James replied, his grip firm. I wanted to thank you again for everything. Eastwood waved him off. You've done the hard work yourself. I just pointed you in a direction. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Have a seat. Let's talk about this job. For the next half hour, they discussed the security position that had opened up at the studio. It would involve monitoring access points, as escorting visitors, and generally ensuring the safety of the production team and facilities. It was entry-level but offered good pay, benefits, and room for advancement. The hours can be long when we're in production, Eastwood explained, but I think you're used to demanding schedules. James nodded. Yes, sir, and I'm ready for it. Eastwood studied him for a moment. Sullivan tells me you've been doing well in the program, says you've even started mentoring some of the newer veterans coming in. James felt a flush of pride. It was true. As his own situation had stabilized, he'd found himself reaching out to other vets entering the program, offering the same kind of support that had been so crucial to his own recovery. It helps me as much as it helps them, he admitted. Reminds me I'm not alone in this. Eastwood nodded, a look of approval crossing his weathered features. That's good. That connection, that sense of purpose, it's important. He leaned forward slightly. The job is yours if you want it, James. You can start next Monday. James felt a surge of emotion. Gratitude, relief, pride, all mingled together in a wave that threatened to overwhelm him. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Eastwood said simply, as if it were a fact as solid and immutable as the earth beneath their feet. As they stood to shake hands again, sealing the agreement, James found himself thinking about that cold morning 6 months ago. How close he had come to not speaking up, to letting Eastwood walk past, to remaining invisible on that sidewalk. How different his life would be now if he hadn't found the courage to call out. There's one more thing, Eastwood said, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small box and handed it to James. A little welcome gift. James opened the box to find a silver watch, simple but elegant, with an inscription on the back. Time for a new chapter. C.E. Sir, I can't accept, James began, but Eastwood held up a hand. It's not a Rolex, Miller, he said with a slight smile. Just a reminder that no matter how dark things get, there's always time for things to change, to get better. James closed his fingers around the watch, the weight of it solid and reassuring in his palm. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything. As he left the studio that day, the California sun warm on his face, James thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the battlefields of Afghanistan to the cold streets of San Francisco, from invisibility to being truly seen. It had been a road marked by pain and loss, but also, unexpectedly, by kindness and hope. He thought about the other veterans still out there, still struggling, still waiting for someone to notice them, to offer them a hand up rather than a handout. And he made a silent promise to himself that he would be that person whenever he could, that he would pass on the gift that had been given to him on that fateful morning. As he boarded the bus that would take him back to his transitional housing unit, soon to be replaced by an apartment of his own, James glanced at his reflection in the window. The face that looked back at him wasn't the haunted, hopeless one that had stared out from countless reflective surfaces during his time on the streets. It was the face of a man reclaiming his dignity, his purpose, his place in the world. All because someone had taken the time to stop, to see beyond the cardboard sign and the worn clothes, to recognize the human being beneath the label homeless veteran. All because Clint Eastwood had paused on his walk that morning, and in doing so, had changed the direction of a life that had seemed irretrievably lost. And as the bus pulled away from the curb, carrying James toward his future, he made one more promise to himself, that someday, when he was fully back on his feet, he would find a way to thank the man properly, not just with words, but by becoming the kind of person whose life honored the second chance he'd been given, by becoming visible again, not just to others, but to himself.